Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're cracking open a chapter of history that's, well, let's just say it's a bit spooky.
It is a bit spooky, yes. We're talking about the rise of spiritualism in the 19th century
Yeah.
and the kind of shadow movement of theosophy.
Right. So, for those of you just tuning in, think dimly lit rooms, mysterious figures claiming to talk to the dead, tables moving seemingly on their own.
Exactly, and a whole lot of controversy. I mean, were these genuine attempts to contact the spirit world, clever illusions, or something else entirely?
That's what we're going to untangle today. We've got some really fascinating sources to work with.
We do. Personal accounts from people who attended seances, historical records of key figures, and some very sharp critical analysis of what was going on.
Our mission, as always, is to distill all of that down to the most intriguing bits, the surprising twists, and of course the hard questions that this period raises.
Because, let's face it, there's something inherently fascinating about the idea of contacting the dead, a question that has haunted humanity really from the very beginning.
Absolutely. And our source actually starts with that very question. If a man die, shall he live again?
It's a line from the book of Job. And the source points out that this yearning for an afterlife, for something beyond our physical existence, has preoccupied some of history's greatest minds.
Socrates, Plato, even figures like Christ, they all grappled with this fundamental mystery.
They did. And what's striking is that this deep interest in the spiritual often intensifies during periods marked by significant material progress. It's like the more we focus on the tangible world, the more we crave something beyond it.
Like a counterbalance almost. And right in the thick of the Industrial Revolution, boom, modern spiritualism emerges.
It explodes onto the scene with the famous Hydesville rappings on March 31st, 1847.
Oh, right. Those two young sisters, Kate and Margaretta Fox, they claimed to communicate with spirits through these knocking sounds.
Exactly, and it captivated the public imagination. I mean, people were flocking to their home to witness these so-called spirit communications.
But of course, with any phenomenon like this, skepticism follows pretty quickly.
It does. Our source mentions investigations by Professors Flint Lee in Coventry, who offered a more down-to-earth explanation for the rappings.
Which was?
They believed it was all about voluntary control of knee joints or even just the snapping of toes, basically tricks that anyone could learn with a bit of practice.
Oh, wow. And perhaps most tellingly, Margaretta Fox herself later confessed in 1888 that it had all been a hoax.
She did, yeah. But even with that confession, spiritualism didn't just vanish. It had already taken root in society, evolving into a full-fledged movement with professional mediums popping up everywhere.
Like a cultural wildfire.
Exactly. Figures like Mrs. Hayden brought it to England in 1852. Seances were being held in drawing rooms, people trying to contact their loved ones, hoping for some sign from beyond the grave.
So, with this sudden surge in popularity, scientists and scholars naturally tried to make sense of it.
They did. Our source outlines three primary explanations for the physical phenomena associated with spiritualism.
Okay, lay them on me. What were they?
Well, the first one was hallucination. The idea that people were experiencing shared sensory illusions influenced by suggestion and expectation.
Right. But our source does point out that mass hallucinations are incredibly rare.
They are. I mean, the Encyclopedia Britannica even mentions that mass sensory hallucination in a normal state is highly improbable. So, while individual misinterpretations might occur, it doesn't really explain the full scope of the reported phenomena.
Okay, so hallucination probably not the whole story. What was the second explanation?
Outright trickery,
Oh,
or conjuring, as it was often called.
right. The old smoke and mirrors routine.
In a sense, yes. Our source's author actually was pretty convinced that this was the primary explanation for at least 7/8 of what was happening during these seances.
7/8. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. But the source does go into great detail about some of the tricks that were used. We'll get into those a bit later. But that still leaves a fraction of occurrences that are harder to dismiss as just simple illusions.
Right, the 1/8 that couldn't be explained away as trickery or hallucination.
Exactly. Our source presents accounts from people who seemed credible. Scientists even, who reported witnessing objects moving without any physical contact.
Like tables tilting, levitating objects, things like that.
Precisely. And this is where the idea of some kind of unexplained force comes into play.
Interesting. The source mentions Count Agénor de Gasperin. He conducted experiments in broad daylight where people would join hands around a table, focus their minds, and reportedly influence its movement.
He did. He attributed this to something called psychic force, a mental or nervous energy emanating from the human personality.
And this is where we get the term telekinesis, right?
We do. coined by Dr. Elliot Coos, the idea that thought alone could move matter.
And this idea gained enough traction that serious scientists like Professor Crooks and Professor Lodge began investigating it.
They did. They were looking for a scientific explanation, a way to understand these events without resorting to spiritual intervention.
Okay, so we've got these possible explanations: hallucinations, trickery, and a new unknown force.
We do.
Yeah.
And of course, you always have the skeptics who try to debunk these claims.
Our source mentions J.N. Maskelyne, a famous conjurer, who argued that a lot of what was going on, particularly with table turning, could be explained by unconscious muscular action.
Right. He drew on the work of Michael Faraday, the physicist. Faraday had conducted experiments showing that people could unconsciously exert pressure in the direction they anticipated the table to move.
Ah, so even seemingly inexplicable movements could have a perfectly mundane explanation rooted in our own expectations.
Exactly. But alongside these physical phenomena, there was also the more subjective side of spiritualism. Things like trance speaking and automatic writing.
Right, where mediums in altered states of consciousness would suddenly reveal information that they seemingly shouldn't have known.
Exactly. And this raised a critical question. Was it evidence of spirits communicating through the medium, or could it be attributed to some hidden psychic ability within the medium themselves?
And this brings us to telepathy, or thought transference.
Yes. This idea that thoughts, feelings, even sensations could be transmitted from one mind to another without any sensory input.
And this wasn't just some fringe idea. Organizations like the English and American Societies for Psychical Research were actively investigating it.
They were, with key figures like Edmund Gurney, Frederick Myers, and Frank Podmore leading the charge. And in Europe, you had researchers like Pierre Genet and Charles Richet also exploring this phenomenon.
And what's interesting is that they weren't just collecting anecdotal accounts. They were trying to develop a theoretical framework to understand how telepathy might actually work.
Right. Podmore, for instance, he defined telepathy as a communication between mind and mind, other than through the known channels of the senses.
Okay, so not through sight, sound, touch, taste, or smell.
Exactly. He theorized that the physical changes in the brain during thought or sensation might generate some sort of undulation in an unknown medium.
Undulation, like waves.
Kind of. And these waves could then trigger corresponding changes in another brain, leading to the transfer of thoughts or feelings.
It almost sounds like some kind of early radio transmission, but for thoughts.
There are some parallels there, yes. Dr. Achorovitch even drew an analogy to the photophone, where voice was transmitted via a beam of light.
So they were really trying to ground this idea of telepathy in something tangible, something potentially measurable.
They were. But not everyone was entirely on board. A.J. Balfour, a former president of the SPR, he questioned whether telepathic action followed the same rules as other known forces, like light or gravity.
Like, could it be directed? Could it be blocked? Did it weaken with distance?
Exactly. He was urging caution and more rigorous investigation.
Okay, so with that background on telepathy, our source provides some fascinating case studies to illustrate this idea of thought transference. The first one is actually the author's own personal experience with a medium named Miss Gall.
Yes. Ms. Gall gave a remarkably accurate description of a deceased general, including details about his appearance, his cause of death, even his inquiry about someone named Mary.
And what struck me was that she even got the initial D of Mary's last name correct, but then seemed to struggle with the rest of it.
Right. It's that mix of specific accuracy and uncertainty that makes it so intriguing. Was it a lucky guess, or was there something more at play?
Then there's the railway accident dream, which again involved the author. He had a vivid dream of a man being decapitated at a railway station.
And this dream coincided with a real railway accident that the author reported on that very night.
Chilling, right. And to make it even stranger, the author's brother had the same dream.
The shared nature of the dream and its precise timing in relation to the real event certainly lends credence to the idea of some form of thought transference.
It does. And the final case study involves a rather lighthearted prank. Someone named L decided to play a joke on his friend X by drugging him and shaving off his rather impressive beard.
But, and this is the kicker, X had a dream beforehand that accurately described the entire prank, right down to L accidentally cutting him with the razor.
It's that level of detail, accurately reflecting a plan that was supposed to be secret, that makes it so difficult to explain away as just pure coincidence.
Absolutely. And our source actually connects these experiences of thought transference to what are often perceived as ghostly visitations.
Right, those instances where people report seeing a vision of a loved one who has just died, often at a great distance.
Exactly. While spiritualists would interpret this as the actual spirit of the deceased appearing, the telepathic explanation frames it as a subjective hallucination.
A powerful thought or impression transmitted from the dying person to a distant friend or relative.
Precisely. But it's worth noting that these visions are sometimes reported long after the person's death or they're revealed through mediums.
Which muddies the waters a
Mhm.
bit, doesn't it?
It does. It raises the question, is a ghostly apparition an external entity or an internal manifestation triggered by some unknown form of communication?
Okay, so we've talked about these more subjective aspects of spiritualism, but our source then takes a decidedly more skeptical turn when it comes to physical mediumship.
It does, starting with the practice of automatic writing.
Right, where people would hold a planchette, go into a trance, and seemingly write messages from the spirit world.
Exactly. While acknowledging that unconscious muscular movements likely play a role in many cases, the source highlights a crucial observation made by Professor Tamburini,
Which was?
that sometimes the writing revealed facts that were completely unknown to the person holding the planchette.
Ah, so it wasn't just their subconscious mind dictating the writing, there was potentially something else influencing the process.
Right. And this brings the possibility of telepathy back into the equation. But the source is very clear about distinguishing between genuine phenomena and outright trickery.
It calls out the public psychics who claim to demonstrate thought transference, but were really just skilled con artists.
Yes. It mentions Washington Irving Bishop, the so-called muscle reader, as a prime example. He relied on keen observation and a deep understanding of involuntary muscle movements to create the illusion of mind reading.
So basically, he was a master of cold reading and subtle cues.
Exactly. And this skepticism really ramps up when the source delves into the exposé of slate writing mediums, particularly the infamous Dr. Henry Slade.
Slade was a big name in the spiritualist movement. He claimed to channel spirits who would write messages on slates, often sealed or hidden from view.
Right. But our source's author, after initially being baffled by Slade's methods, met a conjurer, referred to as C, who revealed the secrets behind Slade's tricks.
Okay, so spill the beans. How did you do it?
Well, the conjurer staged a mock séance for the author, replicating all of Slade's signature moves, the loud raps, the guitar playing on its own, and of course the slate tests. All clever illusions. For instance, in one slate test, a message appeared on the underside of a slate that was pressed against the table. Slade had written on the slate beforehand, in reverse, so it would appear correctly when viewed from the other side.
Sneaky.
Very. Another test involved a chafing dish cover. It was even more elaborate, involving a hidden assistant who swapped prepared slates and used a concealed device to simulate spirit writing.
Wow. Talk about stagecraft.
Right. And the key, as the conjurer explained, was misdirection, drawing the observer's attention away from the crucial actions.
The source even quotes Dr. Max Dessoir, who said that eyewitness accounts from people unfamiliar with magic are often quite naive.
They are. And we tend to see what we want to see, especially when it comes to something as extraordinary as spirit communication.
And Slade's story doesn't end well, does it?
It doesn't. The Cyber Commission, which was tasked with investigating spiritualist phenomena, hired a conjurer named Harry Keller to test Slade's methods.
And what happened?
Keller, using purely stage magic, managed to replicate and even surpass Slade's feats. The commission ultimately concluded that Slade was a fraud. Yeah. Slade's career pretty much imploded after that. He was exposed in London, faced criminal charges, and ended up fleeing to the continent and even to Australia.
And to think that it all started with a few knocks on a table.
It's a cautionary tale, really. A reminder that fame and fortune can be fleeting, especially when built on deception.
Okay, so we've talked about Slade's rather blatant trickery. But what about those mediums who seem to produce genuine messages? The ones who weren't caught red-handed?
Well, our source examines that too. It uses the example of a Mr. Keeler, a slate-writing medium whose messages were often vague and evasive.
Like the classic, spirit is here but can't communicate clearly. excuse.
Right, and the source questions the assumption that handwriting on slates proves authenticity. I mean, what's to stop a medium's supposed control spirit from simply disguising its handwriting?
Good point. The source's author even expresses regret for not bringing marked slates to their observation of Keeler, due to the medium's notoriously bad temper.
Apparently, Keeler wasn't too keen on being scrutinized too closely. And this actually highlights a challenge that skeptics faced at the time,
Which was?
that many mediums were incredibly resistant to rigorous testing. They would claim that it interfered with the delicate spirit communication.
Ah, so it's a convenient way to avoid being exposed.
Precisely.
Mm.
And the source details some common tricks used by these slate-writing mediums. One involved using paper slips with questions written on them. The medium would subtly swap the sitter's slip with one they had prepared beforehand.
Classic sleight of hand.
Exactly. Dr. Hodgson, a researcher for the SBR, he experienced this firsthand with a medium named Mrs. Gillette. And then there was Dr. Taylor, who attempted to test Pierre Keeler, another slate-writing medium, using marked slates and sealed questions.
Did it work?
Not really. The implication being that Keeler, and many others like him, couldn't perform their feats without knowing the questions in advance.
Makes sense. They needed that information to craft their seemingly miraculous answers.
Right. And then there's the truly audacious sealed slate test, which, according to the exposé Revelations of a Spirit Medium, involved a whole elaborate setup with a hidden Confederate, trapdoors, dummy slates, and pre-written messages.
Wow, so basically a full-blown stage production masquerading as spirit communication.
Essentially, yes. And the source even describes the ingenious trick of producing writing between locked slates using a magnetized pellet of chalk dust. It really shows the level of ingenuity that some of these illusionists brought to their craft.
It's almost impressive in a way. They had to be incredibly skilled to pull off these deceptions.
They did. But of course, it also highlights the lengths to which some people would go to exploit the public's belief in the supernatural.
Okay, so we've explored the darker side of mediumship, the tricks and deceptions, but now let's talk about the man who was often hailed as the king of mediums, Daniel Douglas Home.
Ah, Home. A fascinating and controversial figure.
He was, and despite claiming to despise money, he certainly moved within the highest circles of European society.
He did. His early life is shrouded in stories of second sight, ghostly encounters, strange phenomena.
Like the classic haunted house origin story.
Right. He conducted seances in America, but it was his arrival in Europe that really made him a sensation. People were comparing him to Cagliostro, the infamous 18th century occultist.
That's high praise or infamy, depending on how you look at it.
It is. And Holmes' alleged powers were quite varied. He claimed to levitate, to move objects with his mind, to communicate with spirits.
There are even accounts of him handling hot coals without being burned.
There are. The source mentions Professor Crooks's investigation of these claims, and an account by a Mr. H.D. Jenkin, who witnessed Holmes seemingly cooling and reheating coals and even placing them on a newspaper without causing any burns.
That's pretty hard to explain away, isn't it?
It is. But the source does offer some possible explanations. Chemical treatments that could increase heat resistance, or the use of amianthus gloves, which are made from a type of asbestos known for its fire-resistant properties.
Okay, so not necessarily supernatural, but still pretty impressive.
Right. But there were also incidents that cast doubt on Holmes' authenticity. The discovery of phosphorated oil in his possession, for instance.
Oh, which could have been used to create the illusion of spirit lights.
Exactly. It's hard to know for sure what to make of Holmes. Some people were utterly convinced of his powers, while others saw him as a clever trickster.
It seems like he might have been a bit of both.
Perhaps. The source even mentions a skeptical cousin who was present at some of his seances, providing a more grounded perspective.
Good to have a voice of reason in the room. And what about his famous levitation feats?
Well, Mr. Angelo Lewis, a writer on magic, offered a possible explanation. He suggested a technique where a medium, skilled in ventriloquism, could place boots on their hands to create the illusion of floating limbs in a darkened room.
Ah, I see. So not actually floating, but creating the impression of it through clever manipulation and sound.
Precisely. And the materialized spirit hands that Holmes often produced.
Those creepy, disembodied hands that seem to appear out of thin air.
Right. Those could have been created using a wax dummy hand attached to an elastic band concealed in the medium's clothing.
So basically, a stage prop.
Essentially, yes. But even with all of this skepticism, some of Holmes' feats, particularly those witnessed by Professor Crooks, remain difficult to fully explain.
The source specifically mentions the apparent movement of heavy furniture without any physical contact.
Yes. Crookes conducted elaborate experiments with home, using a spring balance and recording apparatus to measure any variations in weight.
And
He reportedly observed measurable increases and decreases in the weight of objects, even when home only lightly touched them or was in close proximity but making no direct contact.
wow, that's pretty hard to dismiss as simple trickery.
It is. Sergeant Cox, who was also present during these experiments, even suggested that a force emanating from the human nervous system could impart motion and weight to objects.
So basically a scientific explanation for what appeared to be psychic phenomena?
In a sense, yes. But the source does emphasize the uncertainty surrounding Holmes' purported powers and the exhaustion he often displayed after seances.
It's almost as if these feats, whether genuine or not, took a toll on him.
Perhaps. And it also mentions Dr. Hammond's attempts to replicate some of Holmes' effects using static electricity and magnets.
Okay, so again, pointing towards a possible scientific explanation for these seemingly supernatural events.
Exactly. But Holmes remains an enigma, a figure who continues to fascinate and frustrate those who try to understand him.
He does. And now, for a bit of a change of pace, let's talk about the Davenport brothers, Ira and William.
Ah, the Davenports, the masters of rope tying and cabinet seances.
Their story starts with the familiar tales of ghostly occurrences during their childhood.
Right. Unexplained sounds, moving objects, the classic haunted house tropes.
And their father is even credited with devising their famous rope-tying feats after witnessing the performances of Indian jugglers.
Interesting. So it's possible their act had roots in traditional stage magic.
It is. Their subsequent tours generated huge public interest, especially in England, where Punch magazine dubbed it typhus fever.
And even the skeptical Jan Maskelyne, the conjurer we mentioned earlier, admitted that their feats, if presented as pure jugglery, were still quite remarkable.
High praise from a man who made a living exposing fraudulent mediums.
It is. Their arrival in Paris was met with a lot of fanfare, but also some concern.
Concern.
Yes. Some segments of the Parisian press worried about the potential impact of their performances on public mental health.
Wow. I guess that says something about the grip that spiritualism had on the public imagination.
It does. So their typical performance consisted of two parts, a light seance and a dark seance.
And what happened during these seances?
Well, the dark seance was the main event. It centered around a cabinet containing various musical instruments.
Classic spirit cabinet routine.
Exactly. A committee chosen from the audience would tie the brothers securely inside the cabinet. Then, in complete darkness, all hell would break loose. Ropes flying out of the cabinet, bells ringing, musical instruments playing. It was all attributed to the actions of unseen spirits.
And how did they do it?
Well, Herman the Conjurer famously exposed their methods during a performance at Cornell University.
Okay, spill the beans. How did they pull it off?
Students, armed with phosphorus balls to create their own light, revealed that the brothers themselves were manipulating the instruments and even projecting spook pictures inside the cabinet.
Ah, so all stagecraft, no spirits.
It seems so, yes. Despite this exposure, the Davenports continued to perform, and they did have some financial success.
But their reputation was tarnished, wasn't it?
It was. And William Davenport eventually renounced spiritualism before his death.
But their act, the cabinet routine, it became a staple in the spiritualist movement, didn't it?
It did. Many other mediums adopted it, and conjurers like Maskelyne and Keller even perfected it using purely mechanical means.
So even in exposing the trickery, they were contributing to the evolution of stage magic.
In a way, yes. The source even mentions a brief revival of the Faye Davenport Act in 1895, during which the author actually participated as part of the tying committee and learned the secret of the mystic tie.
Interesting. So they were still at it, even after being exposed.
They were. And the source also details other variations of the cabinet trick, including the spirit necktie illusion and the use of confederates or plants in the audience to enhance the illusion of supernatural phenomena.
It's all about creating that sense of wonder and the impossible.
It is. And the source also mentions Annie Eva Faye, another famous materializing medium who used a cabinet and a post for tying.
And how did she pull off her tricks?
Well, the source describes how spirit levitation was often achieved using hinged steel bands concealed under clothing, and the spirit necktie illusion typically involved cutting and substituting ropes in the darkness.
So again, all clever stagecraft. The author even recounts their own attempt at simulating a materialization during a séance with a Mr. Tabor, demonstrating how easily such deceptions could be staged.
It's a good reminder that seeing isn't always believing, especially in the realm of the supernatural.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about spiritualism, telepathy, fraudulent mediums, the works. But before we wrap up, let's touch on a couple of other intriguing topics that our source mentions: thought photography and apparitions of the dead.
Okay, thought photography. It was this idea that thoughts or images could be captured on photographic plates.
Like a physical manifestation of mental imagery.
Exactly. The source acknowledges the lack of strong evidence to support this claim, but it does suggest a potential connection to the possibility of genuine spirit photographs.
Interesting. So, if thought photography were to be proven real, it might lend some credence to the idea that spirits could also imprint themselves on film.
It's a speculative connection, but a fascinating one nonetheless.
And what about apparitions of the dead?
Well, the source doesn't delve into personal anecdotes, but it does reference the research of the Society for Psychical Research.
Which found?
That there seems to be a statistically significant correlation between the deaths of individuals and apparitions of those individuals being seen by others around the time of death.
Really?
Yes. The Literary Digest even published a review of the SPR's report titled A Census of Hallucinations, which detailed the rigorous process of collecting and analyzing these reports.
So not just random ghost stories, but a systematic attempt to study these phenomena.
Exactly. Professor J.J. Haslop, writing in The Independent, even argued that this research provided evidence for the independence of mind and body.
So even in death, a part of us might persist, capable of interacting with the living.
It's a thought-provoking idea, isn't it?
It is. And finally, we come to Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society.
Ah, Blavatsky, a truly remarkable and controversial figure.
Our source describes her as a fantasist, a spirit medium, a self-proclaimed priestess of Isis, and, of course, the founder of the Theosophical Society.
She was a force of nature, by all accounts. Enormously overweight, with a harsh voice and a quick temper, but also possessing this incredible charisma that drew people to her.
Like a magnetic personality.
Exactly. Her early life is full of fascinating anecdotes, stories of haunted houses, psychic abilities, and even a marriage to a much older General Count Blavatsky.
It sounds like she was destined for an unconventional life.
She was. Her travels took her to India, and she even attempted to enter Tibet, a place that held deep spiritual significance for her later teachings.
And what about the phenomena associated with her?
Well, there were reports of materializations, objects moving without being touched, even the seemingly impossible feat of making light objects suddenly become heavy.
Sounds like classic spiritualist fare.
It does, but Dr. Elliot Hughes, he offered a different explanation. He believed that Blavatsky was simply a skilled medium who was exploiting a familiar spirit entity known as John King.
Right, that mysterious control spirit that many mediums claim to channel.
Exactly. The source even describes the typical appearance that mediums often adopted when portraying John King.
So, basically, a stock character in the spiritualist world.
In a sense, yes. The author of our source met Blavatsky at the Eddy House and was struck by her unusual appearance, contrasting sharply with the other guests.
And what about the seances held at the Eddy residence?
Well, those were apparently quite the spectacle. All sorts of ghosts materialized, including figures identified as Turks, Kurds, and Kalmucks.
Wait, Turks, Kurds, and Kalmucks?
Yes. Colonel Occult, a close associate of Blavatsky, actually cited this diversity of spirits as evidence of genuineness, based on the assumption that the Eddy boys wouldn't have known about such people.
Okay, that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it?
It is, but it highlights the lengths to which Blavatsky's supporters went to defend her claims.
So, with all of that as background, what exactly is theosophy?
It's a complex system of beliefs, drawing on elements of Eastern religions and Western esoteric traditions.
Okay, break it down for me. What are the core principles?
Well, theosophy claims its origins in the 3rd century A.D. and purports to offer the hidden or esoteric meaning behind world religions.
Okay, so a kind of universal truth underlying all spiritual traditions.
In a sense, yes. Key principles include reincarnation, the idea that we are reborn into new lives, and the ultimate goal of achieving nirvana, a state of liberation from suffering.
And what about Blavatsky's claims about the Mahatmas?
Ah, the Mahatmas, or adepts, were supposedly a secret brotherhood residing in Tibet, possessing extraordinary spiritual powers.
And Blavatsky claimed to be their chosen messenger, communicating with them through astral projection.
She did, and she attributed many of her phenomena to their intervention, but these claims were later exposed as fraudulent.
The source mentions an incident in India involving a couple named M and Madame Coulomb, who worked at the Society's headquarters in Edyar.
Right. They reveal the existence of a hidden occult room and a shrine where messages from the Mahatmas were supposedly received.
And Richard Hodgson, the SPR investigator, he thoroughly debunked these claims.
He did. He found evidence of trapdoors, handwriting analysis suggested that Blavatsky herself was writing the Mahatma letters, and he corroborated the truthfulness of the Coulomb's disclosures.
Ouch, that's a pretty devastating blow to Blavatsky's credibility.
It was. The Mahatma letters that seemingly fell from the ceiling, those were likely manipulated using silk threads or hidden trapdoors.
And her ability to receive messages from distant countries almost instantaneously?
Explained by prearranged telegrams.
Uh,
And the precipitated Mahatma photographs, those were created using chemicals to produce the images.
so smoke and mirrors all over again?
It seems so. And the source highlights the critical analysis of Vsevolod S. Solovyov, a Russian writer who became disillusioned with Blavatsky and her methods.
Solovyov's book, A Modern Priestess of Isis, really pulled back the curtain on her deceptions, didn't it?
It did. He recounts instances where he caught her red-handed staging phenomena using trickery to create illusions.
He even describes an incident where he caught Blavatsky's servant trying to forge a Mahatma message in Russian, a language the servant didn't even know.
It's almost comical, isn't it?
It is, and what's perhaps most damning is that Solovyov claims that Blavatsky confessed to him about the necessity of using deception to control people.
She admitted that her phenomena weren't genuine. She even tried to enlist him in her schemes.
But then, of course, she later retracted her confession, blaming a mysterious black magician for her actions.
It's a classic tactic, isn't it? Shifting the blame, creating a scapegoat to maintain the illusion.
It is. So despite all of these exposures, Blavatsky still managed to produce a significant body of work, most notably Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine.
She did. And she claimed to have received direct assistance from the Mahatmas in writing these books. But upon closer examination, they've been found to contain numerous plagiarisms and inconsistencies.
William Emmett Coleman's analysis of Isis Unveiled described it as a disorganized collection of absurdities and stolen material.
And the Secret Doctrine is supposedly based on a fictional ancient text called the Book of Jain.
So more fabricated history and borrowed ideas?
It seems so. And the source recounts the rather